Every year during draft time, NBA fans all over the world have their opinions on which prospects are going to be stars and which ones will become busts. However, trying to make these predictions can be very difficult. Oftentimes, guys look really good before entering the league, but then their skills don't necessarily translate to the NBA. Then on the other hand, many players get slept on going into the draft, and then they proceed to become better players than the guys drafted before them. For NBA fans, being right or wrong about a certain player doesn't really mean much at the end of the day. They can brag about it or laugh it off because ultimately it doesn't have an effect on their livelihood. But what about the people and teams that actually make these selections? Like I said, trying to make the right pick can be extremely challenging. For general managers around the league, the selections they make can either make or break their careers. And for the organizations, draft selections can determine how their franchise is viewed in the NBA world. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the 5 teams with the worst draft history since 2010. Now, before I get into the 5 worst teams, I wanted to quickly mention 3 teams that just missed out on this list. Those teams are the Suns, the Jazz, and the New York Knicks. The Suns and the Jazz have had a few really bad selections in recent memory. I'm just going to leave some of their worst picks since 2010 up here on the screen. But the Suns and the Jazz have also made some very good draft picks as well. And in all likelihood, these teams will be playoff teams this year due to the great picks that they have made. In the case of the Knicks, I nearly put them on this list. They've only had 5 lottery picks since 2010, but they have still had some very questionable selections. Porzingis, he was a great pick in 2015, but they followed that up by selecting Frank Ntilikina in 2017 and Kevin Knox in 2018. However, they've seemed to be making some better decisions in recent years, picking guys like RJ Barrett, Mitchell Robinson, Emmanuel Quickley, and Obi Toppin. And in the case of the 5 teams that I'm putting on this list, they've consistently been in the lottery since 2010 and haven't been able to put together promising teams through the draft. With that being said, here are the 5 teams with the worst draft history since 2010. Number 5, the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cavs did not have a selection in the 2010 NBA draft, but they ended up getting both the number 1 and number 4 picks in 2011. With those picks, the Cavs picked up Kyrie Irving and Tristan Thompson. However, next year's draft is when things started to go downhill in Cleveland. In the 2012 draft, the Cavs had the 4th pick and used that on Dion Waiters. The idea here was that Irving and Waiters would become one of the best young backcourts in the league. Unfortunately for the Cavs though, Waiters was relatively inefficient and inconsistent, and he and Kyrie couldn't seem to get along off the court either. As a result, Waiters was traded midway through his 3rd season in Cleveland. The worst part was that Waiters was picked ahead of both Damian Lillard and Andre Drummond. While this pick was really bad for the Cavs, there's nothing that can top what they did in the 2013 draft when they selected Anthony Bennett with the 1st overall pick. This was a complete shock to many because although Bennett was viewed as an interesting prospect at the time, websites like Bleacher Report had him going 7th overall just weeks before the draft. As we know, Anthony Bennett ended up being one of the biggest draft busts in NBA history, and while the 2013 draft class was relatively weak, Bennett was picked over Victor Oladipo, CJ McCollum, Steven Adams, and Giannis Antetokounmpo. After this pick, things did start to look better for Cleveland though. In 2014, they drafted Andrew Wiggins number 1 overall, eventually trading him for Kevin Love. Now with the big 3 of Kyrie, LeBron, and Kevin Love, the Cavs didn't have a lottery pick until 2018, which was a pick that they received from the Celtics in the Kyrie Irving trade. And with that 2018 pick, they ended up selecting Colin Sexton, followed by Darius Garland in 2019, and Isaac Okoro in the most recent draft. Time will only tell if their 3 most recent lottery picks turn out to be good, but they have shown promise so far. So as you can see, the Cavs have had some really good draft picks in recent memory, but they've also had some really, really bad ones as well. Unlike all the other teams on this list, Cleveland ended up winning a championship in this time frame, but that was because of LeBron's return, not because they were able to build a contender through the draft. However, with LeBron's return in 2014 seeming inevitable in retrospect, you have to wonder what would have happened if they had selected guys like Damian Lillard, Andre Drummond, or Victor Oladipo instead of Dion Waiters and Anthony Bennett. Number 4, the Minnesota Timberwolves. Similar to the Cavs, the Timberwolves have been very up and down with their recent draft picks. For every Karl Anthony Towns or Zach LaVine, there was a draft bust that hindered the development of this franchise. In 2010 and 2011, the Timberwolves selected Wesley Johnson with the 4th pick and Derek Williams with the 2nd pick. Neither of these guys are in the league anymore, yet Johnson was selected over guys like DeMarcus Cousins and Paul George, and Williams was picked ahead of Kemba Walker, Klay Thompson, and Kawhi Leonard. In 2014 and 2015, the Wolves enjoyed some nice draft success with selections of Zach LaVine and Karl Anthony Towns. However, this success was short-lived, as in the 2016 draft, the Timberwolves drafted Chris Dunn 2 spots before Jamal Murray and 6 spots ahead of Domantas Sabonis. After a rough 2016-17 season, Minnesota traded for Jimmy Butler, so they didn't end up picking in the lottery until the 2019 NBA draft, where they got Jarrett Culver. While it's still very early, Culver has not looked like a number 6 overall pick so far. Their most recent lottery pick, Anthony Edwards, has shown a lot of potential, but similar to Culver, it is way too early to conclude anything just yet. When evaluating Minnesota's draft history, their biggest mistake was clearly selecting Chris Dunn over Jamal Murray. Wesley Johnson and Derrick Williams were not good picks either, of course, but at the time, Minnesota was looking for wing players, and wings such as Paul George, Klay Thompson, and Kawhi Leonard that were picked later in the lottery were not expected to be as good as they have become. On the other hand, the Timberwolves were looking for a point guard in 2016, and Dunn and Murray were considered to be on the same level relatively. Unfortunately, Minnesota just picked the wrong guy. With the emergence of the Murray and Jokic duo in Denver, Wolves fans have to be wondering what a Murray and Towns duo would have been like in Minnesota. Hopefully Culver and their most recent lottery pick, Anthony Edwards, can develop into good NBA players so that this Timberwolves franchise can become a consistent playoff team. Number 3, the Detroit Pistons. Since 2010, the Pistons have not had a ton of success in the lottery. Only ever picking as high as 7th, Detroit clearly struggled when trying to evaluate mid to late lottery talent. The Pistons haven't made horrible selections over the years, as a few of their picks have turned out to be solid role players in the league. However, the players they drafted didn't exactly move the needle in Detroit, and they missed out on having many star players. Kicking off the 2010s, the Pistons used their 7th overall pick on Greg Monroe. Statistically, Monroe had some pretty good seasons in Detroit, but he was picked just 3 spots ahead of Paul George, a guy that obviously went on to become a perennial all-star in the league. Next year, they had the 8th pick, selecting Brandon Knight, 1 spot ahead of Kemba Walker, 3 spots ahead of Klay Thompson, and 7 spots before Kawhi. Again, Knight was not a bad NBA player. He averaged 13 points and 4 assists his first 2 years in the league, and if Detroit hadn't given up on him so early, they could have had a guy that went on to have multiple seasons averaging 17 to 19 points per game. Even still, Detroit clearly missed on this pick, as Kemba, Klay, and Kawhi ended up becoming 3 of the better players throughout the 2010s. 2012 was a good draft for the Pistons, as they ended up bringing in Andre Drummond, but in 2013 they picked up KCP, another guy that would become a solid role player but nowhere near a star level player. Just 2 spots after KCP, CJ McCollum was picked. 2 spots after that, Steven Adams' name was called, and we all know that Giannis was selected with the 15th pick in that draft as well. Since 2014, the Pistons have only had 3 lottery picks, as they had either traded away their first-round picks or selected outside of the lottery because they had made the playoffs. Their 2015 selection was the first of these 3 picks, and while some of their previous selections turned out to be solid players in the NBA, Stanley Johnson was just a complete bust, hearing his name called before both Miles Turner and Devin Booker as well. Fast forward to 2017, and Detroit now had the number 12 pick in the draft. With that pick, they selected Luke Kennard, who again turned out to be a solid NBA player. However, if the Pistons were looking for a shooting guard, they would have been better off drafting Donovan Mitchell, who was picked immediately after Kennard. Also still on the board, Bam Adebayo was drafted just 2 spots after Kennard, going number 14 to the Miami Heat. Their most recent lottery pick was in 2020 when they selected Killian Hayes, and I am very high on Killian, knock on wood. Hopefully injuries don't end up derailing his career, because despite a bad start, I think he's got a ton of potential. Even though Detroit missed out on a lot of star talent over the years, I couldn't put them number 1 or number 2 on this list because Stanley Johnson was the only guy that was just a flat-out bad NBA player that they drafted. As you'll see, the next 2 franchises on this list ended up picking multiple bad NBA players in the lottery from 2010 up until now. Number 2, the Charlotte Hornets. Looking at this team's draft history, I feel awful for Hornets fans. Their first lottery picks of the 2010s came in the 2011 draft. The Hornets made 2 choices in the lottery this year. They made the wrong choice by trading for the 7th pick and selecting Bismack Biyombo, but they did make the right choice by drafting Kemba Walker 9th overall. However, the Hornets were in the lottery 6 times between 2012 and 2018 and made a bad decision every single time. In 2012, they picked Michael Kidd-Gilchrist over Bradley Beal. Damian Lillard and Andre Drummond. In 2013, they picked Cody Zeller over CJ McCollum, Steven Adams, and Giannis. 2014 brought them the 9th overall pick, and they drafted Noah Vonleh instead of Zach LaVine, TJ Warren, or Yusuf Nurkic. And the sad part is that it gets worse. In the 2015 draft, they selected Frank the Tank Kaminsky ahead of Miles Turner and Devin Booker. And in 2016, they didn't have a lottery pick because they made the playoffs. So fast forward to the 2017 NBA draft, and the Hornets are back in the lottery now with the 11th pick. With that pick, they selected Malik Monk, 2 spots in front of Donovan Mitchell and 3 in front of Bam Adebayo. In 2018, they had the 11th pick yet again, originally selecting Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, which was a good pick, but then they eventually traded him to the Clippers for 2 future second-round picks and the rights to Miles Bridges. And don't get me wrong, Miles Bridges is a nice young player. He's been playing very well this year, but Shai could be an all-star within the next few seasons, and I don't know if I can say the same for Miles Bridges. These past 2 drafts, the Hornets have made some good picks in the lottery, getting PJ Washington and LaMelo Ball, but looking at their draft history in depth, I can see why Kemba got out of there. The most notable thing for me was all the shooting guard prospects that they missed out on. They had the chance to select Bradley Beal, CJ McCollum, Zach LaVine, Devin Booker, Donovan Mitchell, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Charlotte could have had one of the best backcourts in the league with Kemba and literally any of the guys that I just mentioned, but they missed out on all of them. Hopefully now that the Hornets appear to have a new franchise centerpiece in LaMelo Ball, they can actually put some nice talent around him. Because man, if they fail as badly with LaMelo as they did with Kemba, I'm gonna have to say a little prayer for any Charlotte Hornets fans out there. While the Hornets have made some terrible choices in the lottery since 2010, there is one fan base that has had it even worse than Charlotte has. Number 1, the Sacramento Kings. Man, I do not even know where to begin with this team. They are pretty similar to the Hornets in the sense that they ended up drafting a star in DeMarcus Cousins in 2010, and everything just went downhill after that. Did the Hornets make some really bad draft picks over the years? Yes, but at least their worst picks have a chance of playing in the NBA this year. Malik Monk, Bismack Biyombo, and Cody Zeller are still with the Hornets. Frank Kaminsky is on the Suns. MKG was on the Knicks preseason roster, and Noah Vonleh was on the Bulls preseason roster as well. In the case of the Kings, I couldn't even remember off the top of my head the last time some of their picks were close to getting on an NBA roster. Once again, 2010 was a good draft for the Kings. They ended up drafting DeMarcus Cousins. 2011 comes, and the Kings pick Jimmer Fredette, 1 spot ahead of Klay Thompson and 5 in front of Kawhi. Jimmer's been great overseas, but he's played in 12 NBA games since 2015, and he most likely won't play in the league again. Next year, they have the 5th pick and select Thomas Robinson over Lillard and Drummond. Like Jimmer, Robinson is also playing overseas right now and hasn't played in the NBA since 2017. The 2013 draft wasn't much better, as the Kings drafted Ben McLemore over CJ McCollum, Steven Adams, and Giannis. While McLemore has found a nice home in Houston as a shooter off the bench, he was on the verge of being out of the league before he signed with the Rockets last year. In 2014, the Kings missed on another shooting guard, picking Nick Stauskas over Zach LaVine. At the making of this video, Zach LaVine is averaging 25 points per game for the Bulls, while Nick Stauskas is in the G League. The sad part is that it's not even over yet for the Kings, because in 2015, Sacramento got Willie Cauley-Stein, choosing him over Miles Turner and Devin Booker. Then in 2016, the Kings had the 8th pick, which they could have just used to draft Domantas Sabonis, but instead they traded for Georgios Papagiannis, Skal Labissière, and Bogdan Bogdanovic. While Bogdanovic turned out to be a pretty good player, the Kings ended up losing him for nothing this past offseason. Finally, after all those years of making horrible draft mistakes, the Kings got one right in 2017 with their selection of De'Aaron Fox. But then they went back to making bad decisions by drafting Marvin Bagley III over Luka Doncic. Now, I do think that Bagley has the potential to be an all-star in this league. Up to this point, he hasn't been looking like a number 2 pick yet, and considering Luka is already an MVP caliber player for the Mavs, it's just not looking good for Sacramento. Then Sacramento's next lottery pick came this year in 2020, where they drafted Tyrese Halliburton, who I really like, but it's also too early to say whether that was the right pick for the Kings or not. In a league where smaller market teams are at a huge disadvantage when it comes to acquiring star free agents, It's extremely important that these teams are able to draft well, because if not, you end up with a team like the Sacramento Kings, who haven't made the playoffs in 14 years, and in all likelihood, won't make the playoffs this year either. That's all for today's video. Let me know some of the worst picks that your favorite team has made in recent memory. And with all that being said, I'm out.